Imagine landing on the Virginia coast with 100,000 men. It is the spring of 1862.
Right.
The United States is tearing itself apart, and you have one objective and basically one summer to end the Civil War by capturing Richmond. One campaign, one knockout blow.
The stakes are just massive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there is a catastrophic problem. The command structure is attempting to navigate a living, breathing battlefield using a map that's based on a French engineering survey that is incredibly older than the United States Constitution.
Yeah, it is the absolute definition of friction. You have this incredibly high stakes, time compressed operational reality, right? And the foundation of every tactical decision being made is fundamentally severed from ground truth.
Which is wild. So if you are listening to this, welcome. You are an active duty warfighter. And our mission today for this deep dive is exploring a read-ahead packet for a really unique professional military education event.
Yeah, it's a great packet.
It is. We are looking at a specific tool used to study the friction you just mentioned, the staff ride. More specifically, an innovative application developed by the Catholic Men of the Chapel at Langley Air Force Base and the Catholic Military Apostolate.
Right, they call it a spiritual fitness staff ride.
Exactly. And the goal here isn't to, memorize dates or troop movements. It is to ignite the warfighter ethos and study the ethics of warfare using the battlefield as a laboratory. Specifically, the 1862 assault at Lee's Mill, or Dam Number 1.
Yeah, and to understand why a historical battlefield serves as an ethics lab, we really have to look at the lineage of the staff ride itself.
Okay, let's unpack this, because most of us think of ethics as, like, a corporate compliance module.
Right, or an academic philosophy class. But the staff ride strips away that sterile environment. The concept originates with Karl von Clausewitz, who argued that warfare is dominated by friction. That grinding, chaotic force that turns simple plans into complex disasters.
Oh, yeah. The fog of war.
Exactly. Clausewitz believed the only way to build the judgment necessary to survive that friction is to examine real choices made under intense, lethal pressure.
Because you just can't simulate the psychological weight of a life-or-death decision in a sterile classroom.
No, you can't. And later on, Helmuth von Moltke the Elder formalized this into a strict methodology. You study the campaign, you walk the actual ground, and you reckon with what the terrain and the human cost reveal that a two-dimensional map just never could. The U.S. Army adopted this back in 1906.
So you literally stand on the ground where the decision was made.
Right, because the terrain forces you to confront the reality the commander faced. But the Catholic Military Apostolate takes that traditional framework and pushes it into the realm of character.
How so?
Well, a conventional staff ride asks how a commander decided to maneuver forces. This spiritual fitness version asks why they made that choice and, what kind of person they had become by the time that moment arrived.
And the packet defines spiritual fitness in a very specific operational way. It isn't just maintaining a positive attitude or a generalized sense of well-being.
Right. It defines it as the developed capacity to act on what is right, even when doing so is incredibly costly.
So if physical fitness dictates how long your body can endure the battle space, and mental fitness dictates how your brain processes the operational variables, spiritual fitness dictates why you are enduring the friction in the first place.
Exactly. It frames virtue as a mechanical habit. This relies on the classical tradition of virtue ethics, which asserts that qualities like prudence, the ability to see reality clearly, and fortitude, holding the line, they aren't just inherent personality traits, they're operational capacities.
Like muscles you train.
Exactly. In terms of neurobiology and psychology, when you make a hard choice under stress, you are physically wiring your brain to make that choice easier the next time. You build character deliberately through repeated disciplined choices.
Or you lose it quietly through repeated unseen compromises. And the source material is remarkably blunt about why this is a critical requirement right now. With modern warfare integrating AI-driven systems and autonomous weapons, decision timelines are compressing from hours down to seconds.
Yeah, it's terrifyingly fast.
You don't have time to figure out your moral baseline while taking fire. The decision matrix has to be preloaded.
Because a warfighter who hesitates in the moment due to moral confusion is a catastrophic vulnerability to the unit. Moral failure at the operator level inevitably cascades into strategic failure at the national level.
Which brings us to the actual ground of the Peninsula Campaign, and the first major ethical collapse of those 100,000 men. The Union Army is moving up the peninsula toward Richmond, and they hit a geographic wall, the Warwick River.
Right. And here is where we get to the first ethical maxim. Faulty assumptions kill.
Because of the map, right.
Yeah, according to the maps, the Union commanders were using specifically Thomas Jefferson Cram's map, which was built on that 1781 survey. The Warwick River was supposed to run parallel to their line of march. It was supposed to be a flank boundary.
But when the lead elements actually hit the terrain, they discover the river runs perpendicular. It cuts directly across their axis of advance.
And nobody in the command structure verified the ground beforehand. The entire operational plan was built on an inherited, unverified document.
They were operating on the assumption that a map drawn 80 years prior was still ground truth. It's just absurd.
It is. And that blind reliance on an untested assumption creates what the source calls the mud tax. When you refuse to verify reality, the environment extracts a toll.
The spring rains hit, right?
Oh, yeah. The unmapped terrain turned into a swamp, wagon wheels were swallowed whole, artillery sank, horses literally drowned in the mud.
Wow.
Meanwhile, General George McClellan is leading from a headquarters tent miles behind the front lines, just entirely detached from the physical reality his men are suffering through.
He's relying on private detectives for intelligence, right?
Yeah, and they are feeding his own cognitive biases, telling him he is vastly outnumbered by the Confederate forces.
Which Confederate General John Magruder completely exploits. Because Magruder only has 13,000 men defending a 12-mile line against McClellan's 100,000, it is a mathematically impossible defense.
Completely impossible. So Magruder uses deception to feed McClellan's faulty assumptions. He marches his troops in continuous loops through the clearings to simulate massive reinforcements.
And the Quaker guns?
Yes. He even props up painted logs in the earthworks, the so-called Quaker guns, to simulate heavy artillery placements. The Union command, paralyzed by the assumptions they brought with them and unwilling to walk the ground to verify, are held off by lumber and paint for 11 days.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. How often do we do exactly this in modern operations? A node gets comfortable operating off a standard procedure or relying on a sensor feed without ever stepping out to verify the actual terrain.
All the time. Prudence is the first casualty here. Prudence isn't just caution. It is the disciplined verification of reality before committing forces. Every failure here happened because leaders acted on what they preferred to be true.
We even do it at home. Assuming we know what a spouse is thinking, or assuming a financial plan is sound just because it's comfortable, without ever looking out the window to verify the actual terrain.
We constantly confuse having a routine with having a grip on reality. And when you build an operational plan on top of a comfortable fiction, the execution of that plan is inherently flawed.
Which is exactly what happens when the Union command finally realizes they have to force a crossing. They can't bypass the river. So on April 16, 1862, at Dam Number 1, 6 commanders formulate a plan.
And this brings us to the second maxim. Competence is a moral virtue.
Because instead of committing the weight of the army, they send just 200 men of the 3rd Vermont across the freezing waist-deep water. They call it a reconnaissance in force.
Right.
The men step into the water, holding their heavy muskets and powder above their heads, walking directly into pre-aimed Confederate trenches. And against all mathematical odds, those 200 men cross the kill zone, storm the trenches, and actually take the position.
They kick the door open.
Yeah, they do.
And the moment they achieve that tactical success, the command structure behind them completely disintegrates. The generals built an operation with a single point of failure regarding command and control.
I remember reading this in the packet and being shocked. The entire reinforcement plan rested on one junior officer, Captain Hutchinson.
Yep. Holding a white handkerchief as the sole visual signal to push the rest of the troops across.
Wait, one handkerchief for a whole operation?
One handkerchief. And when Hutchinson is mortally wounded in the water, the handkerchief goes down. General Smith is knocked unconscious on the dry bank. The plan just dissolves.
But let me push back on the premise that this was a moral failure. A reconnaissance in force is a standard doctrinal tactic. You probe the enemy line to find a soft spot. If a probe goes poorly, why is the source material classifying a standard tactical maneuver as an ethical collapse?
Because of the intent and the resourcing behind the maneuver. A doctrinal reconnaissance in force implies the readiness to rapidly exploit any success the probe achieves. You don't send troops into a meat grinder just for optics. Just war doctrine explicitly deals with this under the requirement for a probability of success. The ethical mathematics of command dictate that you cannot expend human life without a viable, redundant plan to sustain those lives. The generals had no redundancy.
So they essentially planned for a fantasy scenario where the enemy didn't shoot back and nothing broke down.
Precisely. Sending 200 men into a fortified kill zone without backup and without the unshakable intent to sustain them isn't a probing tactic. It's ethical abandonment.
If you assign one person to a critical task with no backup, you aren't planning for reality. You're just disguising hope as a strategy.
Exactly. Competence in planning isn't just a professional standard. It is a moral obligation to the people executing the plan.
And that puts the commanders on the dry bank in a horrific position. The plan has dissolved. Their men are holding the far bank completely isolated, waiting for reinforcements, which yields the third ethical maxim.
Delay is a decision.
While the 200 Vermonters hold those trenches, the generals on the dry bank simply freeze. They had already spent 6 hours that morning putting on an artillery bombardment that achieved nothing but theater.
Yeah, artillery theater.
Now, staring at an actual breach in the enemy line, they are paralyzed by the fear of looking reckless. They refuse to send the reinforcements.
And their reaction demonstrates how cowardice disguises itself as deliberation. There is this pervasive illusion that waiting is a safe choice. That if you just pause, you are freezing the clock until you have a better tactical advantage.
But the clock doesn't pause for the enemy, and it doesn't pause for your problems.
Time is never neutral. Every minute those generals spent hesitating on the dry bank was a minute the enemy weaponized. While the Union leadership debates the optics of reinforcing, Confederate General Howell Cobb physically arrives on the field with 4 fresh, dry Georgian regiments.
And the cost of waiting is just brutal. The Vermonters have been wading through chest-high water, their firing caps are soaked.
Yeah. When Cobb's fresh troops counterattack, the Union muskets misfire. The men of the 3rd Vermont are reduced to swinging useless sticks of wood against a fresh brigade with dry powder.
They're slaughtered in hand-to-hand combat and driven back into the freezing river. 310 casualties, entirely because the command structure chose to wait.
And the compounding debt of that hesitation doesn't end at the riverbank. Because the generals fail to exploit the breach, McClellan uses the failure to justify his own pre-existing assumptions. He opts for a 30-day siege.
30-day siege.
Yeah, ordering elaborate trench networks dug. And 2 days before his meticulously planned artillery barrage is supposed to fire, the Confederates realize they've bought all the time they need. They just pack up their equipment and walk away.
They spent 30 days waiting for a battle the enemy had already left. And because they didn't push through that open door when they had the chance, the war drags on for 3 more years. 600,000 lives lost.
Delay is not a pause button. It is an active decision that increases risk and compounds cost. And usually, it's paid by someone else.
The commanders on the dry bank failed all 3 ethical tests. But the staff ride doesn't end on leadership failure, right? It pivots to the men in the water who provided the ultimate counterpoint.
Right, the faces in the water. The source packet highlights 3 specific individuals who had no clean intelligence, no perfect conditions, and catastrophic leadership failing them from above. Yet they chose rightly anyway.
Let's talk about William Scott.
William Scott was a Union private and a farmer from Vermont. His presence there is incredible because he'd actually fallen asleep on sentry duty earlier in the war. He was sentenced to death by firing squad.
But President Lincoln personally intervened and pardoned him.
Yes. And upon returning to his unit, Scott made a promise to his comrades that he would prove to the president he wasn't afraid to die for his country. On April 16th, he waded into the Warwick River, took 5 or 6 bullets during the assault, and died of his wounds. He kept his word.
Wow. And then there's Julian Scott.
Julian Scott is amazing. He was not an infantryman. He was a 15-year-old drummer boy. He carried no weapon. When the command collapsed and the Union troops were being driven back into the water, this 15-year-old boy repeatedly crossed the kill zone under direct Confederate fire to pull wounded men to safety.
Just a kid.
Yeah. He later described the musket fire hitting the water as looking just like sap boiling. And one of the men he dragged out of that boiling stream was actually William Scott. For repeatedly crossing a kill zone unarmed, a 15-year-old was awarded the Medal of Honor.
Which is incredible. And finally, Captain Samuel Pingree.
Right. With the operation disintegrating, the general unconscious, there was a total vacuum of leadership on the far bank. Someone had to establish command.
And Pingree steps into the gap. He is severely wounded himself, but he rallies the remaining men, establishes a defensive posture, and holds the line against the counterattack to buy time for the retreat. He also earned the Medal of Honor for his actions.
The contrast is the entire point of the study. These 3 men had none of the advantages of the generals safe in the tent. What they had was the developed habit of virtue.
They didn't suddenly invent character in the middle of a freezing river. They met the moment as the people they had already become. The moment of crisis doesn't make the man, it merely reveals his pre-existing habits.
Exactly, which is the core mechanism of spiritual fitness. Character is forged in the unseen hours. It is the discipline you maintain when nobody is watching.
So, having seen the historical evidence of both ethical collapse and individual virtue, the deep dive turns directly to you, the listener. Where does this live in your life today?
The Read Ahead packet bridges this gap with a modern fictional short story called The Glass Horizon. It drops us onto a modern operations floor with Lieutenant Caleb Rourke, an intelligence analyst.
Right.
He's staring at an AI targeting system that has flagged a contact as a Chinese stealth fighter. High confidence. Red icon. The pilot and the strike cell are screaming over the comms, demanding Rourke authorize the engagement immediately.
The pressure is entirely focused on generating a fast, lethal answer.
But Rourke notices an anomaly, a tiny secondary transponder code that the AI algorithm dismissed. The system is offering him a comfortable map, an easy assumption. But Rourke refuses to act on an unverified assumption.
He absorbs the friction.
Yeah, he delays the engagement, pulls up civil aviation registries, and discovers the contact is actually a Philippine medical evacuation helicopter wrapped in electronic deception. Because he had the discipline to verify reality, lives were saved.
But the narrative doesn't let Rourke off the hook professionally. It holds a personal mirror up to him and, by extension, to you.
Oh, absolutely.
Because while Rourke was disciplined in the TOC, he realizes he has been operating off an inherited map in his own marriage. He assumed his wife was perfectly fine handling the entirety of their home life while he was deployed, simply because she wasn't complaining.
He never checked the ground truth.
Right. He was letting the distance between them grow because he assumed he could just fix it later. The source material explicitly demands that the warfighter apply these maxims symmetrically, in the uniform and in the soul.
Where are you operating off an untested assumption in your finances? Or where are you initiating a massive change in your family's life, but ethically abandoning the follow-through because the daily work requires too much friction?
You can't be a prudent, decisive leader in the uniform if you are avoidant and reckless in your own home. The virtue is a habit, not a uniform you put on.
And we see the modern cost of delay in that same story through Specialist Carver. He is staring at his phone, realizing he hasn't spoken to his father in 2 years. There's no massive falling out. It was just the slow accumulation of putting it off until tomorrow.
Delaying a hard conversation is a choice that compounds cost every day. Time is not neutral in your personal life either.
It really isn't.
So, to summarize our mission today, we've walked the ground of dam number 1. We've seen the lethal cost of untested assumptions, incompetent planning, and cowardly delay. And we've seen the sheer willpower of 15-year-olds and wounded captains who held the line anyway.
If there is a final synthesis to draw from this terrain, it is that the distance between knowing the right answer and doing the right thing under fire is closed entirely by daily habit. Ethical readiness is military readiness.
The decisions that will ultimately define your career and your life will not happen in a clean, perfectly illuminated environment. They will happen in the murky, chaotic friction of reality where there are no perfect maps.
And the water is only going to get colder.
So I want to leave you with a final lingering question to mull over today. If character is truly built in the unseen hours, long before the orders are given or the crisis hits, what is one small, seemingly insignificant choice you are avoiding today that is secretly wiring your default response for the next time you find yourself waist deep in the water?